Hi guys, my name's Adam and welcome to my new video. In this one, I'm gonna take a look at this little guy, and that's the iPhone 5S. This one was introduced all the way back in 2013, so it's gonna celebrate its 7th birthday this year. How does this iconic phone hold up in 2020? Is it still somehow possible to actually use it as your primary phone even today? Let's find out in today's video. Here we go. Like I said, the iPhone 5S was Apple's flagship model of 2013, and it was the evolution of the design which they introduced a year earlier with the iPhone 5. Design of the 5S is pretty iconic, and it was so popular that Apple used the very same one few years later with the iPhone SE. It's a beautiful piece of technology with the aluminum on the back and glass here on the top and bottom, and of course on the front side of the phone. It's got a 4-inch screen, and of course the iconic home button is still here on this device. The 5S is a very small phone, and I personally always use the bigger versions of the iPhones, but it's usually because of a better battery, not because of the size. There were times when I was using the 4-inch iPhone, and you can do the same tasks as on the bigger ones. Even the typing experience is not that big of a deal, and after using it for a while, you get used to the small keyboard. So in my opinion, the design is fantastic even today. It's the definition of being compact, and it won't embarrass you when you take it out in a public here in 2020. And I wish the rumors are true and Apple is planning to go back to this type of design with the new iPhone 12. Of course, with a bigger display, bezel-less screen, and all these new fancy features. Like I said, the iPhone 5S has 4-inch display. It's Retina display, so it's got a resolution of 1136 by 640, which is 326 pixels per inch. This is in fact the same amount of pixels per inch as the iPhone 7, 8 or even 10R and 11 have. And the actual quality of the screen is also really good. It's almost hard to believe that this screen is that old. It honestly looks almost the same as the newer iPhones with LCD displays. It isn't as bright on the sunlight, for example. The blacks are a little bit deeper on the newer phones, and it doesn't have these new features like True Tone or 3D and haptic touch. But other than that, it's really great. Colors are nice, and it definitely looks better than some of the screen on today's lower-end phones. The only downside, of course, is the size and the fact that it's not bezel-less, but you definitely can't expect that from a 2013 smartphone. The screen is just fine and you won't have any issues with it if you plan to use this phone today. Under the screen, we can see the home button, and in this home button there's an integrated Touch ID fingerprint scanner. iPhone 5S was in fact the very first iPhone that offered a fingerprint scanner, and it basically started the whole trend of using biometrics as an authentication method on your smartphone. But be aware that this is the first generation Touch ID, and it uses the optical technology instead of a more advanced capacitive scanner that Apple used in the iPhone 6s and newer. So this first generation one is not as fast as the second gen, and it also sometimes has problems to recognize your finger if your hands are, for example, wet or a little bit dirty. I've seen worse scanners, but in today's comparison this one will not be among the fastest and most reliable scanners. But it's still miles better than typing your passcode in every single time, that's for sure. The camera on the iPhone 5S was one of the best ones in its time. Well, in 2020, it's definitely not one of the best anymore, but it aged pretty good. 5S sports an 8 megapixel shooter with the aperture of 2.2 and dual LED flash. The photos from this camera are not bad at all, and in the daylight you can do some pretty good shots with it. But in the lower light scenarios, this phone doesn't catch up to the newer models. There's no night mode, so evening photos are grainy and without any detail at all. But if you're not a professional photographer and you just need a decent camera to take a few shots now and then, you will be just fine with the 5S. The front-facing camera is nothing to write home about, as it's only 1.2 megapixels, so FaceTime is okay, but don't expect to take beautiful selfies with the 5S. But what about video? That's the area where iPhone has always shined, and the 5S takes pretty good video. The rear camera can shoot up to 1080p at 30 fps, so no 4K at 60, but again, 2013 guys. This phone also introduced slow-motion videos, so you can take 720p clips and 120 fps. The front-facing camera can shoot 720p videos at 30 fps, so like I said, FaceTiming is not a bad experience on this device. When it comes to used hardware, the 5S was the fastest smartphone on the planet when it was released. It used custom Apple-made A7 CPU, which was the very first 64-bit CPU ever to be used in a smartphone, which was a huge step ahead. It's a dual-core 1.3 GHz chip with the quad-core graphics and 1 GB of RAM. How does the 5S with these specs perform today? Well, if you use mainly Apple apps, then you're gonna be pleasantly surprised with the performance. Moving around the iOS, web browsing, checking emails, weather and other stuff, it works quite fast for a 7-year-old phone. The bigger issue starts with the third-party apps. Many of them are optimized to run on a newer hardware, so the 5S sometimes struggles. It is very obvious in the loading times. It sometimes takes forever to load apps like Instagram or Facebook. But once the app is loaded, it actually performs good, to be honest. But don't expect any heavy multitasking with the 5S. It only has 1 GB of RAM, so it can keep many apps open in the background, so be prepared for constant reloading. And if you play games, then the 5S is not the best device for you. It can run most of the casual games, but it can't handle anything more graphically intensive, like popular Fortnite, Call of Duty or PUBG titles. Apple made the iPhone 5S in 16, 32 and 64 GB options, so no 128 gigs here, but that would honestly be an overkill for this device. Like I said in my previous videos, try to avoid the 16 GB option, as it's just too small for today's big apps. But if you're really thinking about getting the 5S in 2020, then you probably need it as a secondary device, or device for your parents, grandparents or small kids. And you probably want it to be cheap, and a 16 GB version is obviously the least expensive one, and most of used models today are actually 16 gigs. So it's probably okay to get one, as far as you plan to use it mostly with only the Apple apps, and install like just a few additional ones from the App Store. If you plan to use anything else, get the bigger option, or a newer phone. Battery life is one of the weakest spots of the iPhone 5S in 2020. There's a very small 1560 mAh battery, and we all know that iPhones don't need crazy big batteries because of a great optimization of hardware and software. But the capacity of this battery was small even back in 2013, so don't expect a great battery life with the 5S. Also, you can get this phone only used today, so the battery could be significantly degraded in these used models, and prepare for the possibility of having it replaced. It's a shame that you don't get the battery health feature on the iPhone 5S, as it's only available on the iPhone 6 and newer. Because with this feature, you are able to see what's the actual capacity of your battery. But even with a new battery, expect a below average battery life on the 5S. With a very little usage, and by that I mean few phone calls, few messages, maybe checking an email every now and then, you can get to a full day of battery life. But if you plan to use third-party apps, and social media apps in particular, then better have a charger with you all the time, because you're gonna need it often. The iPhone 5S holds an interesting record, because it's the iPhone that was supported for the longest time. The 5S originally came with iOS 7, and through the years it received updates to iOS 8, 9, 10, 11, and finally and surprisingly even iOS 12. So it was supported from 2013 up to 2019 when it received its last feature update with the release of iOS 12.4. But Apple kind of supports the 5S even today. You don't get any new features on this phone, but Apple still releases occasional security updates. Like for example, just a few weeks ago they released iOS 12.4.6, which fixed some of the security issues. So you don't have to worry about this device not being secure or something. And like I said, the 5S is currently running the latest version of iOS 12, so right now it's only one major version behind the current iOS 13, so the experience is pretty similar. You don't get the new dark mode or other iOS 13 stuff, but it still feels pretty recent. You can install almost any apps from the App Store, because third-party developers usually support the older versions of iOS for like 2 or 3 years at least. But be prepared that in the future, the app support will get worse and worse. So let's try to answer the ultimate question from the title of this video. Is the iPhone 5S still usable in 2020? And as usual, it depends. The 5S is probably the cheapest iPhone you can get today. The older ones are actually more expensive because they're already considered rare, and the newer ones are pricier because they are more powerful and offer more functionality. The 5S is somehow usable even in 2020 because of the fantastic support and the fact that this old champ is running iOS 12. You basically get most of the functionality of the newer models. You can browse web, you can take photos and share them to social media, you can use the Apple Music or even watch TV shows on the new Apple TV+. So yes, you can do almost anything with the 5S. But there's a but. Definitely expect a lot of loading screens, and just be prepared to wait for a lot of things to open on the iPhone 5S. Also get some external battery, because this one won't last you a long time. But if this is the first phone for your kids or the phone for your grandparents, then yeah, go for the 5S. And also let me say, this phone is freaking beautiful, like definitely one of the best designs of all time in my opinion. So guys, that was it for today's video. Did you own an iPhone 5S? Or do you still have it, or maybe even plan to buy one here in 2020? What do you think about this phone? Let me know in the comment section down below, and please give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it helps a lot. Also consider subscribing for more content like this. So until the next time, have a great day, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, and see you in the next video. Bye!